Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this latest installment of the Centurus Knowledge Series, wherein we tap our industry-leading experts, consultants, and trainers to present areas of interest on topics that are relevant in the industry, particular to analysis, analytics, and BI. Today, we're excited to present the topic of Power BI, DAX, and give you a kickstart on the overview and the mechanics of data analysis expressions. Our agenda today, after some brief introductions, we'll get into an introduction to data analysis expressions. We'll talk about various vehicles of delivery, in other words, the calculation types and calculation columns and measures. We'll talk about the different function types that are bucketed into several different groups and give you examples within each of those groups. We'll summarize, we'll talk about some great additional resources that Centurus has to offer, and then we always wrap up with the question and answer session with any remaining time. Our presenters today, I'm pleased to be joined by Centurion Bill Pearson, who is a Microsoft Business Intelligence Architect with Centurus. He's a 30-year BI veteran and a CPA with experience in accounting and finance, ERP, and CRM systems. He's adroit in legacy and modern platforms and is proficient across the Microsoft BI stack and brings a true wealth of hands-on experience with his work in Power BI, SQL Server Analysis Services, SQL Server Reporting Services, and Excel Power Pivot. My name is Mike Weinhauer. I'm a practice area director here at Centurus and solution architect and the host of our Centurus Knowledge Series. So before we get into the content with our esteemed presenter, I always like to get a finger on the pulse of our audience here. And so we're going to take a quick poll here that I'm going to launch. And the question is just getting a handle on the overall experience level of our audience with DAX expressions. So are you brand new to this? And this is really what that audience is the audience this presentation is kind of geared towards. Have you played around with it? Are you a beginner where you write basic DAX queries? Are you intermediate where you actually create calculations, maybe perhaps somewhat complex calculations? And then are you an advanced level where you can meet 1+ business requirements with DAX above and beyond? And we'll share the results. So we have a pretty good distribution here. Plenty of you are new to this, so half are kind of in the beginner, 3/4 in the true novice, another quarter in beginner, and then got a few gurus out there. So thanks for joining us, and I'll give you a sense for kind of your audience, Bill, and their level of expertise. And with that, I am going to hand the microphone and the floor over to you, Bill, for the body of your presentation. It's all yours.
Great. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are on the planet. My name's Bill Pearson, and this is introducing data analysis expressions, or DAX, as it's fondly referred to. DAX, as most of us know, serves as a language, a query language, and a manipulation language for Power BI, Excel Power Pivot, and SQL Server Analysis Services tabular. I don't know how many of you have worked with any of those, but it got its start in Power Pivot. I was really involved in the rollout of it for Microsoft, and it's going through some rapid changes. Everybody's probably noticed it's 45 to 65 or more updates a month. So it's amazing to stay on top of it. You have to put some time into it, and DAX itself grows by leaps and bounds as well. DAX initially seems simple, but the learning curve can increase dramatically and at the worst possible time. So you want to try to look at examples, and I'll give a little advice here of ways to become familiar and at least comfortable with DAX as we go along. DAX comprises programming concepts that will be unfamiliar to many that have worked with SQL and other languages, even MDX. Those are different languages, and there are a lot of things that look kind of funky when you first look at it and all that, but it'll grow on you pretty rapidly. And we'll discuss some tips in easing that effort, as I've already noted. DAX is an expression language. Function calls drive execution. Elements of DAX are derived from Excel. A lot of it is Excel functions. A lot of this will be familiar, things like sum and count and things of that nature. SQL and MDX, an example of a simple formula, and this is probably real simple to everybody. We're just taking a customer count, so I'm just basically saying count customer and customer key. The only difference in this and the Excel expression is that we're basically telling it the table in Power BI in this case, and then the column in the table, and telling it to count those. The general format again is table name and then column name. You can put the table name in parentheses. You don't have to if the table name doesn't contain spaces. The best practice, therefore, is to not use spaces. Before you get too far into DAX, if you're just learning it, go over the best practices. You can Google it and find a lot of best practices of things that they suggest that you do and don't do, and you'll start out with a good habit instead of having to go back and change things you've done in the past and that sort of thing. It's always best to start out right. The table name can be omitted. The current table search for the column name, again, the best practice, always use the complete table name and column name to avoid ambiguity. If there's a column name in the model that doesn't appear anywhere except the one place, you can get away with the column name, but always think about what might happen if the model changes later, if it grows, and also things like, you want to make it easily read by whoever follows you. You want it to be self-documenting, so it's always good to use that name and avoid ambiguity. Brackets for the column name cannot be omitted. The primary vehicles for DAX, and that's just my terminology, the primary vehicles are basically calculation types, and they can best be employed through calculated columns and measures. There are two different ways to create the different functions that you build from DAX formula. Example of a calculated column, and I make the names kind of long, and you're going to find, and we're going to mention this more than once, naming a calculated column or measure is pretty significant because somebody's got to look at that name and know what it does. You can imagine even if we're a mile long, that would be hard to do in the number of characters that you have. But what I'm doing here is keying it to my DAX model so I can easily find things. You may have other ways to do it. You probably would. You'd probably want to say just product margin or something like that here. But we're basically taking the list price column minus the standard cost, and it's just as straightforward as that. Again, you're probably thinking you wouldn't need the parenthesis here. That's correct. Not the parenthesis, the apostrophe. Okay, so let's take a look at a demo of creating a calculated column. The far right column is the product margin. There's a way you can change the name in there even though your formula uses something different. I'll try to stay out of Power BI too much because we've got a lot to cover, but I'll actually show some of that as we go along here. So let me just pull that up right quick. Okay. The calculated column here, we see product margin. We're basically, all you really got to do is click the visual it's in. And I'm not going to get into the visuals themselves too much. It's kind of beside the point. We could be doing this with other tools as well. But I can look in product here and it basically isolates what we have in the visual itself. And here we see the two types of vehicles I talked about, the calculated column and the measure. Notice the difference in the icons. And we'll talk about what's better for certain cases and all that shortly, but let's just look at this first calculated column. Okay, see I've got it over here as product margin. You can change, when you drag the values in, you can change the names, and that's what actually shows up on your visual. You see up at the top here, we've got, oops, sorry about that. We've got the intro calcul product margin, and we've got product list price minus product standard cost, and that's what's giving us that. A lot of times when I'm doing a calculation, I like to put the pieces that make up the calculation total into the visual just to make sure everything's working right. I can do a quick visual check and make sure that my DAX is correct. Particularly important in your early use of DAX. You always want to make self-checking features, and I'll show some more ways to verify your work as we go along. These are just basic ideas to help you learn DAX in a way. Nothing super important. Not really a best practice or anything like that. Okay. Measures creation. The other option for a vehicle is a measure. A measure in the product table that computes the total quantity based on order quantity in the related internet sales table. So we're doing two things here. We're basically, well, let's just talk about the basic formula first. This is just a summary. We're going to do the total quantity. The sum is internet sales times for the order quantity. So we're summing up the order quantity in the actual table. Okay, so let's take a look at that. Okay, I've got a slicer over here, and this is just to help me with filtering down my selection and stuff like that, but you can really see all I'm doing here is summing this. They come out to be the same number. It's not really of a whole lot of impact, but that's basically what I'm doing here. So I'm really just saying quantity and then sum it up, and it sums up to be the same number. So there's not really a whole lot involved in this one. We look up here, the formula bar at the top is where I put my DAX. There's my my function and formula right there. So I'm showing sums there. Okay. Creating the measure, again, this is just a picture of it. The measure's to the right there. The standard column, summarization's turned on. That's why we're seeing the same total there. If we had summarization turned off, we would see the details for all the different rows and stuff. You can do that. You can actually write reports that do a lot of detail reporting in Power BI, but it kind of gets around the purpose of summarization and aggregation that typically winds up in dashboards.
And this
Calculate.
is when, okay, sorry, Bill, you're about to define that, the difference between a calculated column versus a measure. Carry on.
Right, okay. Calculated columns are best when we need to slice or filter on data. Measures are best when we need to calculate percentages, calculate ratios, perform complex aggregations, and fully take advantage of filter context as well as hierarchies and things of that nature. Because before I go into the bottom part here, measures are basically taking advantage of what's called context. They're basically saying wherever I imagine a pivot table, and when you move things around in a pivot table, they change. Like if you change it from a detail line to a total line, it basically goes to total. It's smart enough to know where it is. It's context evaluation. When you're using a calculated column, that's called row evaluation. That calculation happens on every single row. So if you've got, say, a table that's 1,000,000 rows and you're computing that, Power BI is extremely efficient with the engine, the X Velocity engine. It's also really good with compression. But when you're talking about anything in a calculated column, you're talking about every time that model's open, that calculation's open. So everything's running in there. So if you do way too much of it because it's easier or whatever reason, and I see it a lot when I go out on implementations, that's a no-no. You want to probably try to keep that in the measures, because measures are only there when we call them and use them. And they're cognizant of where they are, and they basically shift to whatever they need to be in the context. That's a hard concept when you first see it, but you'll get used to it after you work for a while. A great way to think of DAX functions, and there are over 200 now, are as I think there were 4 introduced in the last month's release, are as members of working groups. Now, this is my take on primary groups, and everybody's got their own ideas. Probably there's not any official groups, but some of these just make sense, like text, things like left, concave, right, mid, all the other things that you know from Excel are in there. We're going to take a look at Concatenate in just a minute. Aggregate has got average, count, max, sum, something called SumX, whole different discussion, but there's a lot of different things out there in addition to regular Excel functions. The math and trig functions, we got some interesting ideas in here on ceiling, int for integer, round, and lots of other math and trig functions. Some of them are very arcane. I won't get into all of them. They're like real special uses that we won't really have anything for today. Date and time kind of speaks for itself. That's basically the physical date stuff, like extracting a date, to put date and then put like 2010, 1, 5, it'll give you the date back in that. We'll look at some examples, date value, year, et cetera, et cetera. Time intelligence, one of the things that this does exclusively as opposed to Excel functions, and do a lot of stuff. If you've got a date table out there that you can base it upon, you can essentially point to that date table and say, as of this date in this month, what is the month to date? It figures all that stuff out for you. And what's really cool is if you make a function, and we'll look at some of these, if you make a function for month to date, and then you put that inside another function that says same period last year, it just automatically pulls it out for you. You don't have to do any of those calculations in Excel or even down in your data warehouse or anything like that. It's smart enough to know that. The time intelligence functions are themselves just a really beautiful thing. Foundation functions, this I use this term myself. I've just always used it, but they're really a whole lot of other type functions like calculate, where you can reset that context we talked about and things of that nature. So let's take a look at some of these. And I've got them marked out inside my PBIX, my Power BI model. Let's take a look at Concatenate. Concatenate works almost exactly like you would expect it to. If we look at, say, I don't know, over here and say, take a look at the calculation itself, I've got it inside customer. What I'm doing, I had a business need. A customer asked me to concatenate the first and last names. It's a real simple scenario, but I want to put it, like you see in the picture here, Adams area, and I want a single spaced, name of a customer. I could also add in all kinds of other things about the customers. I could do all sorts of other things like put in things like their, put commas between the words and, sex, date of birth, all those kinds of things could be added in there. But we're basically doing a very, very simple calculation here. The problem with the concatenate function, if you'd call it a problem, is basically you have to nest it if you have more than two things you're concatenating. So you can easily do that with the ampersand operator. A lot of the DAX functions have operators, and you can just use the operator and just string it along and say concatenate all these things just by putting an operator, an ampersand, between, say, the column names. And that gives you the capability to do a space with a comma between two spaces, all kinds of nuances. It's just way easier to write, pretty easy to follow, so it fits all the rules for, a best practice type thing. Let's take a look at count. Count's one of the basic mathematical functions, aggregation functions actually. Number of customer phone lines. I just want a quick count here to show how many somebody asked for. How many distinct phone lines do we have in our customer database? This is what's called a card in the visuals. You can always see what visual you're using in Power BI by when you're highlighted there, you basically see it highlighted over here in the visualizations. Okay, so let's look at count. I've got customer phone here. So there, okay. DMC, I've got ceiling and int here just side by side to show how they work. Notice that the sum of the standard cost is coming in at 4 decimal places. The ceiling function basically says what's the top of that, and the int is basically showing what's, what does it round to if we're just rounding it to an integer. Got both of these in here. This is very straightforward as the rest of the stuff is. Here's ceiling here. Got ceiling, product cost, and then you tell it how many decimal places to use here. So I hope that makes sense. I'm telling it to go over 2 decimal places, so it tells me the ceiling is this. There's also a floor. I just didn't want to beat the comparisons into the ground. For int here, we've got, it's really nice how you can see all this stuff. It's a little hard to get used to the functions being up in that upper bar sometimes, but you can always see exactly what's in a function if something doesn't seem to be working correctly. We're just basically saying int and then the column name, and it gives me the integer for that. Formatting as far as dollar and all that kind of thing, you do all that with the underlying value. So we could see that pretty easily if we need to go in and change that to be something else. Date and time basics. We got date value, and time value. They're pretty self-explanatory, but let's just take a real quick look in a simple table I've got here. I've got date and time date, and this is just I either fed it in or took it off a URL. I could get it a lot of different places, even out of a table, obviously. But I'm saying 2020, 11/19, and it's basically giving me the date. And that also is influenced by your locale settings on your local PC. Okay. Date value, pretty much kind of the same thing. It's just giving us a date value. And notice I've got these inverted and it still picks it up. Up in the date value function, I've got them in a different order. It still picks up, is smart enough to know what that is. Time is really the same thing as well, but I've got it formatted. I'm telling it time 1330. It's military time, some call it. There are other terms for it. 1330 is basically 1:30 in my local settings, regional settings, whatever you want to call those. And then we've got time value here. Notice I've got it here almost in clock format. It gives it back to me in my local settings format. So you can do a lot of things as far as international translations on these things, all sorts of things. Just remember, it's not just the function telling it what order to put it in, it's also your regional settings have something to do with that. Same thing's true with currency, et cetera, et cetera. Total quarter to date and total year to date. These are the time intelligence functions. Notice there's a difference now between date and time basics and time intelligent functions. There's time functions and there's time intelligence functions. Time intelligence, again, is that thing you can only get here. It's not something you can get in Excel. You could probably do functions in the underlying database to replicate what these do, but you're not going to find anything more useful than these time intelligence functions. Let's take a look at total quarter to date. Notice you can see it's in the internet sales table. I could put by the way, this is kind of important too. Calculated columns have to be in the table that the calculation occurs in. Calculated measures can be anywhere. So one of the best practices, is, at least for user friendliness, is to create a table and put all your measures in one place where people can go find them. A user's not going to necessarily have the cognizance, they won't necessarily know, I've got to go to this table. It just makes it a lot harder, this whole Easter egg hunt of clicking on the visualization and having to go to it and stuff like that. So you can make life a lot easier for your users just trying to think like one. And the good thing is most of us go through that phase learning this stuff anyway. Total quarter to date, you can see up at the top, inside the total quarter to date function is another function. It says sum internet sales amount, and then we've got the context we're giving it. And remember, you could call time intelligence and calculate and several other things, basically the capability to filter something that you're already calculating. So you could create a calculated column called sum sales amount and put that calculation inside this. And this is when it gets really powerful, because you can leapfrog calculations off each other and make it really compact. And again, the biggest challenge with this stuff, once you understand how it works, it's easy to work with. The biggest challenge is naming these things where it makes sense to somebody that's like a casual user. And that's why it's really important to probably keep a table or a spreadsheet, or even use the properties or pop-ups, when you mouse over something, it pops up. You can set all that stuff up to maybe give a little bit more of an explanation, or indeed maybe put a URL in there and take them to a data dictionary of sorts. So that's what that's doing there, saying quarter to date. It looks at the table, it sees the month and year number, and it goes and says, what was the quarter to date value for that? Notice how quarter to date and year to date in comparison here, quarter to date changes every quarter. Notice how it resets at the quarter. Okay, it starts building up like December. Okay, November, these aren't in order. Sorry about that. That's a little bit confusing, I guess. Okay, we've got January, May, it's not, well, I probably didn't order them properly, but what'll happen is it'll reset at the quarter point and just keep going forward that way. So got January, February here. Notice how it increases for the amount. There's a quarter date. It goes up for the amount difference there. Total year to date will keep on going for the whole year long, and come to the totals. They get bigger and bigger as you go down at the bottom. Just take a real quick look at total year to date. Same concept as quarter to date. Again, you just put whatever the function is and give it the date, etc. So it knows to go look at that date row in the date table and knows where it is in time. You just have to have a date table to do this. If you don't have a date table that has a distinct row for every single day in your calendar, it won't work. It's just a best practice you got to kind of observe.
Bill, if you sort that by month year number, would that give you the right order? So
it may. I didn't really look at this, but yeah, there it goes right there.
So then it rolls up.
Sorry about that. It's all right.
You
can see how it works. Like quarter to date here is building up to March. It comes to a total, then it resets here. Notice what's happening in the year to date column is just gradually increasing every single month. Okay. Notice it resets at year end, however. See, it's showing 857 in both places. So you'll find time intelligence something you really want to spend some time on. And we've got a course that basically covers a lot of this stuff that they're going to talk about toward the end here that you'll find find very useful in that regard. We just looked at that stuff in the walkthrough. Couple of points here. Where does DAX fit in? You might be saying, in my building my Power BI model, and that's the context I cast most of this in today. You've got get data, transform, and then when you're modeling and visualizing, that's when the DAX comes to be most heavily important. When you're doing transformations in Query Editor, what used to be called Power Query, recently it used to be called Power Query. But when you're doing it in there, it's done with the M language. You don't use DAX in there, but inside the model and in the visualizations, that's where you come to the decision you need a calculation. And the cool thing about Power BI is you can do it in just about any portion of the app. We got two places here that it's really good for. You can do your calculations in here inside the data view, and you can also do it while you're writing a report. So if you've got the capability to, actually edit and interact with the reports, you can do all of that stuff in both places, where it gives you capability to be able to go in and actually, see that it's working and things of that nature. Okay, let's talk about a few points here as you learn DAX. It's really important that we don't try to memorize. I know a lot of people, I've been in interviews before, and sometimes it's hilarious, but they want you to have memorized the DAX and probably don't even know it themselves, but trying to memorize functions and complex DAX, like solutions to things, is not as important as gaining an understanding of the concepts. You can always look up the functions. There are literally thousands of sites now where people are explaining DAX and all that. Be careful about some of that advice, by the way. Always go with the Microsoft source if there is one, because that's been validated. Most of the stuff's correct. But you can always look up functions, its syntax and samples, etc. Memory can be wrong or incomplete, as we all know, particularly anybody that's getting a little bit older knows that. And you can, pretty much have errors that way if you're not real careful. As we've done in this sample we include in the course, keep a PBIX or a Power BI model full of working samples. Carry around with you on a thumb drive or whatever, and it can save all kinds of time and misunderstanding. If you got to come up with a way, I remember I did that before, or I remember I've seen that done, you've got a working example that way. That's the coolest thing about the compactness of the Power BI file. I call it a lab file, but I like to have that with me wherever I go, preferably on a shared drive or something. Okay. Check out release notes that accompany Power BI updates. I mentioned earlier the frequency and volume of updates is almost impossible to keep up with, but stay on top of it, particularly when a new DAX function comes out, because something you're doing with, say, 3 or 4 different functions stacked on each other, now you can probably do with one function. Time intelligence is an example of that. There's a core function and formula that basically you can do anything like quarter and thing. Quarter is actually one that they don't have in there, but you can do it using some of the others, the standard date quarter, and doing compilations and things like that. You're also going to run into weird stuff about calendars that aren't necessarily calendars, if you know what I mean. There's different types of calendars, and that way you can, you basically can go in and create a function that works across aggregating data, weeks, days, any kinds of things you want to do, you can do that. Constantly deepen your understanding of DAX behavior, which can sometimes be surprising. People internal to Microsoft have a list where they talk about the latest functions, and they say it did something I didn't expect, but it works. It just doesn't work in the way I expected. Always stay on top of those kinds of things so you're not surprised at a bad time. Put thought into naming your measures. I think I put a lot of time in discussing that. Make them easy to locate and easy to identify what their purpose in life is. Maintain environments to support effective learning and development, not just for yourself, particularly with that laboratory file I'm talking about, but you need a development environment, obviously, and a testing environment, and obviously go into production with that. But you want to always be able to not just put a visualization out there that gives you a number, but show how it actually works so it can be verified independently in a different context, and maybe ascertain that it works before you embarrass yourself in front of an employer or a client. Finally, collect working samples, articles, and references. Any of us that work with languages, we're always curious. We always want to stay on top of the different things that we can do, and you get really good ideas when you go out and see what the community's doing out there. Power BI has one of the greatest communities I've ever seen, as far as even if you want a function that doesn't exist or want some kind of capability in Power BI, you can basically go out there and put a suggestion in and people can vote it up. And I've seen things get bumped up to where they'll come in maybe 2 months later. They're paying a lot of attention to that, and it's a great community as far as sharing results and things of that nature too. Summary, we've introduced data analysis expressions, I hope. Vehicles of delivery, the calculation types, remember, are calculated columns and measures. The functions themselves, we just talked about some examples. Remember, they're kind of in a group, and a lot of times you can call it whatever you like. I've seen a lot of different things used there, but that's pretty much totally up to you. I hope this has been helpful.
Yeah, that's great stuff, Bill. So what I see there is, and stick around, everyone, get your questions into the question pane, and we will answer those in just a few minutes here. But I think you can see that DAX is easy to get started with, especially if you're, like most of us, you have a background in Excel, but then it can very quickly get very complicated.
Right.
The other thing that we see is that the introduction of powerful tools like Power BI is that the DAX language really introduces a level of power, but also complexity that you don't typically see in your typical Cognos environments, or even I think you could make the argument your average Tableau environment with the level of power that you have with DAX. And so what Bill has touched upon here is really truly just the surface of it, designed to maybe give you a level of comfort and maybe go out and start trying some of this stuff on your own. But along those lines, we have our annual cyber sale going on here, where we're offering 50% off all of our instructor-led training that ends tomorrow. But that does also include our newly added DAX fundamentals class taught by Mr. Pearson himself, and we're offering that right now for $299. So you'll come out of that with a great handle on DAX. You'll be dangerous, and you'll come out of there with that at least a good starter of that PBIX file with those reference calculations that come out of that. And that's in my mind worth it for that practically on its own. So definitely head out to that link. And on the next slide, if what we find is that folks go through our training or learn through various methods, but then they run into specific issues around their particular business scenario and the dashboards that they're trying to either create or deploy those to the enterprise. So we offer Power BI mentoring to extend that formal training into your actual environment, using your data, your application, using experts like Bill in your environment who have all these years of experience with those hundreds of DAX equations and things of that nature. And we can do that on site or online to either small groups or to individuals. And then if you want to go to the next slide here, talk just a couple minutes about Centurus and who we are. And we are a full service analytics BI consulting company. And if you go to the next slide, you'll find out that our clients know us for providing clarity from the chaos of complex business requirements, myriad disparate data sources, and constantly moving targets. And our name has the strength it has because of our ability to bridge the gap between IT and the business users. We deliver solutions that give your organization access to reliable, analysis-ready data across your organization, so you can quickly and easily get answers at the point of impact in the form of the decisions you make and the actions you take. In the next slide, we talk about how our consultants are leading experts in the field of analytics with years of pragmatic real-world experience. You have guys like Bill, who've been around the block a few times, our favorite urban cowboy, and we are in migration experts. We can help you get from point A to point B, whether that's to the next version, from one platform to another, or if you're developing a coexistence strategy across any of these type of the areas you see in the bullet plates, including hybrid BI environments. We've been at this for a while. If you go to the next slide, Bill, we've been doing this for nearly 2 decades across over 1,300 different clients, ranging from the Fortune 500 down to the mid-market. You'll recognize a lot of the names in this slide. And we've completed over 2,500 analytics projects for areas including the Office of Finance, Sales, Human Resources, IT, across the board. So we hope that you'll consider us for your next analytics project or for any training you might need in Cognos, Power BI, or Tableau. We have some great upcoming events. If you want to move to the next slide, since I guess it's December, we've only got one to show you right here, but bookmark centurus.com/events, and we've got a great one coming up on December 12th, where we talk about steps for building better looking dashboards beyond the default dashboards that people tend to end up with. And that's taught by another one of our amazing Centurus consultants and trainers, Monica Van Loon.
And that's real useful, even if you're working with Power BI or another app too, because best practices and dashboards are often, kind of subjective stuff, like
yeah,
speed of view or something.
That's a terrific point, and actually, has bearing on the next slide too. That the dashboard best practices are germane to any type of visualization, regardless of the tool. So certainly, Monica's focus is on Tableau in that particular one, but the practices are absolutely germane and relevant for a Power BI environment. We recommend that you visit centurus.com, Centurus resources here for some fantastic resources. We've got a lot of Power BI and Microsoft resources out there. We include links in the deck here to some particular ones that are very interesting, particularly Power BI Premium if you're looking towards, again, deploying this more at an enterprise level and you're interested in what the difference is between basic, professional, and premium and what to consider, as well as leveraging paginated reports in the Power BI service and getting into, again, some of that enterprise type stuff where you're maybe considering the on-premise data gateway. We've got a nice blog on that. So we've got a section with our blog, which has nice bite-sized information around what's top of mind at Centurus. And then the resource library has all of our past webinars, and including the one that we've presented here today. And then finally, we invite you to join us. We have a ton of great training for, again, Power BI, Tableau, and Cognos. Bookmark that site. Whether it's corporate training where you need to have a gamut of capabilities and modalities, whether that's self-paced learning, instructor-led, or in-person, and mentoring, we can combine all that into a bundle that meets your corporate needs. Or as individuals, we provide all those modalities, self-paced, instructor-led, and mentoring for individuals. So with that, we'll come to the last slide here, or the second last slide, and we'll get into the Q&A. So please enter those questions there. And the first question we have is really, is there a way, and we're talking about some of the time functionality here, Bill, to specify the year start and end month for a fiscal year in those time intelligence functions based on the year?
Yeah, and remember, that wouldn't be time intelligence. What you're talking about there is extracting information from a date field. So it would be that first set, but there's an EOM function, and just go through those functions. And I'll tell you something else about learning functions. It's almost like it would be beneficial if everybody had time to read a dictionary every now and then. If you read through those functions, you'll be aware of things that you didn't even know you had in there. And just a quick read of what they all do and staying on top of it that way, particularly when you're first getting started. But there are functions that handle that. The things that can't be handled, you can often handle with a juxtaposition of one or more functions. Putting them together, you can get back to whatever you need. In a case where, say, it didn't give you a particular part of a date, it would just be a matter of parsing what's going into the function. So you could take a left 3 or whatever and then put it in, or 4, and then put it in year, and it would get, things like that. So depending on what kind of format your data's in, the approach might be different, the source data, but any of that can be done, and most of it can be done straightforwardly with a pre-existing function.
Well, and I think one of the things that does bring up, though, is that we always recommend that you leverage a time dimension versus trying to do all these gymnastics
Absolutely.
in the tool. And I think you even mentioned that without a time dimension, there's capabilities that you can't take advantage of. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, without a time dimension, you can't do any time intelligence, not with Power BI, and probably not with other different things, particularly Power Pivot or certainly SSAS. A lot of times, though, too, you come across odd things, like you've got a calendar other than a standard date calendar. You might want to, make sure all that's in your date table, like you've got the calendar date and the, whatever, or the calendar quarter and whatever the other month or the other quarter is in the other calendar. Things like 445 and some of these retail things get extremely complicated, but it can all be done. And the table is key to that. There's something, and I'll go through this real briefly, but there's something, a default capability to have Power BI handle that stuff for you, and you don't even need a date table because they want people to be able to get to a quick start scenario, but you're seriously limited, and you need to really understand the implication of doing that instead of a date table. And you can go out and Google that and understand real quickly what that is. This isn't really, what we're covering today, but it's something I warn people off of because it defaults to being left on. And if you don't turn it off, your models are going to grow just huge because it builds all these date tables to handle every single date you've got in your data. So you got to be really careful with that.
So you're talking about the time intelligence functionality in Power BI.
Now time intelligence functionality is what I basically was showing in DAX. Are you talking about the date table itself or the time intelligence capabilities?
No, so there's time intelligence capabilities in DAX, and then there's
Yeah,
a feature where it'll try to do, like, I think like what you're saying, where it'll
yeah,
handle some of that time
yeah.
intelligence automatically for you. And you're saying that that can be very resource and space intensive and not
It's
necessarily give you what you
just
desire.
just leaving that on is basically resource and space intensive, and it also is unreliable at the current stage with lots of time intelligence. It might give you some of it, but your answers aren't necessarily verifiable. So I would recommend, it's just a best practice to always go with a date table. Anybody will tell you that.
Definitely. And so the question of this always that always comes up in my mind is the area of governance and where's the best place to do a lot of this stuff, because
Mhm.
these tools like Power BI and Tableau, et cetera, were born out of this desire for the business to not have to wait for the old school monolithic BI tools to churn their wheels and spit out things, and then in the meantime the business has changed, so the ability to create calculations and models and stuff in the desktop tool is great, but then you end up with potentially lots of different versions of the truth and errors
Right.
and things like that. So what do you, in your experience and your professional opinion, what are some of your, what would you say are some of the key ways that people can govern that and manage that in a Power BI environment?
Well, the ultimate scale out is a great question and one that everybody gets into pretty quick when they start seeing Power BI models replicating all over their organization. But the best way to do it is to get to some kind of semantic layer at a point where all that's maintained in a central environment, something like a tabular model or, even a real heavy data warehouse. But say you can't do that and you've got to, get moving with what you do have, and I understand that certainly. I'm in it all the time. You basically want to have a policy in place or some kind of rules for doing reports. And when people put reports together, the best way to do it is what's called an app workspace. And they put it in there, and basically there are members of that workspace, probably from representative areas like maybe risk management or finance and accounting, representative members that know how to look at it and tell if it looks correct and or to verify it. And at that point, they vote it up and say, let's promote this to popular or general usage.
So in other
So,
words, you have data stewards in
right,
your
correct.
organization that are subject matter experts in the business areas, and those are the ones that you give the capability in Power BI to certify data sources and things like that, so you avoid that proliferation.
Exactly. And that's really important from a couple of perspectives, but that's something that really needs to happen because it's dangerous. You're not worried about gap statements and all that kind of thing, like your financials. If you're an SEC client, you're not worried about that going out because that'll be taken care of and be super inspected before it's published to the general public. But a
Right.
lot of times people think this isn't a gap financial. Why am I worried about, verifiability and all that? A lot of times those internal reports are what, serious decisions are made upon, like make or buy, all these other things. So you can't necessarily, run your business on something that's unreliable with off-road BI. You don't want everybody doing their own thing. You want to be running it through a central mechanism where it's approved, certified, like you said,
Yeah,
and that is important.
I do like that term off-road BI, and tools like this had been kind of ungoverned, and you hear the wild west and that sort of thing, and now they're starting to bake some of those features in, so you're seeing
Right.
certification of data source and more governance in
Exactly.
there. I think it's important, and that's what we do with our clients a lot. Is you need to constantly be evaluating that environment too, and seeing how the business is changing, and inspecting those reports for those calculations and measures, like you said, and consider moving those upstream into the model, and or even further back, maybe into your data warehouse, or that upstream structure.
Right. We're actually engaged occasionally and more actually to come in where people have done it in kind of a roughshod manner and got it up and running, and they want to go, pretty much enterprise level with it, to come in and do, an assurance audit, or just to take a look at, some of the data governance practices, some of the best practices, and make sure that, give you a report back and say these are places you can improve this on. And a lot can be done that way. If you don't know how to do it, we can show you how to do it.
Well, what do you think are the thing that always kind of pops up next in these questions, and in our minds, is the security implications, right? Of you, if you're doing this stuff, oftentimes these calculations, not only do you want to make sure they're accurate, but then if you're creating these rows and columns, you want to make sure that the right data is getting out to the right people, and then where does that security get applied? At the workbook level or further upstream. Can you talk a little bit about some of that?
Are you talking about something like row level security, or are you talking about display? I'm not quite getting the
Yeah,
question.
yeah. I mean,
Okay.
either really. There's just
Mhm.
security ramifications for where you have the data living.
Right. There are basically a lot of ways to secure your data. There are a lot of them that are baked in. You can do at the group level, at the app level. You can say who has access to things and things of that nature. And you can even take it with a concept like row level security, which is essentially role based, ROLE versus ROW. The terms are interchanged a lot, but there are a couple of ways. You can even do it with AD. You can base it on the AD namespace, and other ways even. But you can basically say who can see what and take it to even a granular level with DAX, and say, using username or something like that in your DAX. And it actually performs a lot better than you might expect, but you have to look at all those ramifications before you start, plugging it into your calculations and things like that. Whether you really need granular level. A lot of role-based security is, say you've got 5 or 6 people with budgets working in a community to come to their final, but you may or may not want people to be able to see certain things, like what your payroll is going to be next
Salaries,
quarter,
right?
so,
Mhm.
all kinds of different things like that, because that can also obviously cause some disconcerting reactions and things. But there's a lot of things that you can do with role-based security where people can only see their own department, their own, their division, things of that nature. So that's all been pretty much done very well. You can go out and see it all over the web, and we actually do a lot of that for people who've already gotten up and running, and then we go in and help them to implement that security layer once it's becoming more and more, the mainstream outlet.
Right. And it's the more you can do that at sort of a group level, or
Mm-hmm.
versus at the PBIX or the workbook level, then you save yourself a lot of administrative
Exactly.
hassles.
It's even
Now,
integrated with Microsoft Office, and all of that. You can use your groups across both products and things of that nature. So
well, good stuff. Well, there are some questions in here that are very specific around specific DAX functions, and we try not to get into those in the Q&A of the webinars per se, since we do cover those in our class, and they tend to be a bit of a rat hole for the rest of the audience. So we apologize if we don't answer those particular questions.
We will in the classes, though. In the class, if you have a specific thing, and as time is available, we can often, take that up. Like if we're discussing a function and somebody wants to say, some further ramifications of it, there's usually time to take a little bit of that up.
Exactly. So with that, those are all the questions that I'm seeing in the questions log. If anybody wants to drop any last questions in there, feel free to. Otherwise, if you want to advance to the last slide, please, Bill. I'd like to thank Mr. Pearson here for putting together a great introductory presentation on DAX. Hopefully you understand that it's something that is approachable, but can get fairly complex. It's very powerful. And some of the other, the considerations, the various categories and the types and whatnot. Hopefully you got some good information out of this. If you have any needs or questions or anything about this, you can reach us at our website or at the email address you see there, info@centurus.com. Feel free to call us at our 888 number if you like picking up the phone, and connect with us on any of our social media sites, LinkedIn, SlideShare, YouTube, Twitter, and or Facebook. So thank you all very much for joining us today, you out there in our audience, and we look forward to seeing you again soon on another Centurus Knowledge Series presentation. Have a great one. Bye now.
Bye.